Welcome, friends. Today we're going to be continuing our talks on psychic and noetic action, which is a seminal article that HBB published, which is a fundamental basis for the Theosophical movement articles and so secret doctrine, etc. We're going to have a reading of the Declaration of the United Lodge of Theosophists, followed by a reading from a devotional book, and then get into the talk. The policy of this lodge is independent devotion to the cause of Theosophy, without professing attachment to any theosophical organization. It is loyal to the great founders of the Theosophical movement, but does not concern itself with dissensions or differences of individual opinion. The work it has on hand and the end it keeps in view are too absorbing and too lofty to leave it the time or inclination to take part in side issues. That work and that end is the dissemination of the fundamental principles of the philosophy of Theosophy and the exemplification and practice of those principles through a truer realization of the self, a profounder conviction of universal brotherhood. It holds that the unassailable basis for union among Theosophists, wherever and however situated, is similarity of aim, purpose, and teaching, and therefore has neither constitution, bylaws, nor officers, the sole bond between its associates being that basis. And it aims to disseminate this idea among Theosophists in the furtherance of unity. It regards as Theosophists all who are engaged in the true service of humanity without distinction of race, creed, sex, condition, or organization, and it welcomes to its association all those who are in accord with its declared purposes and who desire to fit themselves by study and otherwise to be the better able to help and teach others. The true Theosophist belongs to no cult or sect, yet belongs to each and all. Following is this form signed by associates of the United Lodge of Theosophists who choose to sign it. Being in sympathy with the purposes of this lodge, as set forth in this declaration, I hereby record my desire to be enrolled as an associate, it being understood that such association calls for no obligation on my part other than that which I myself determine.
Today's reading comes from the voice of the silence. These instructions are for those ignorant of the dangers of lower ED. He who would hear the voice of Nada, the soundless sound, and comprehend it, he has to learn the nature of dharana. Having become indifferent to objects of perception, the people must seek out the Raja of the senses, the thought producer, he who awakes illusion. The mind is the great slayer of the real. Let the disciple slay the slayer. For when to himself his form appears unreal, as do on waking all the forms he sees in dreams, when he has ceased to hear the many, he may discern the one, the inner sound which kills the outer. Then only, not till then, shall he forsake the region of Asat, the false, to come unto the realm of Sat, the true. Before the soul can see, the harmony within must be attained, and fleshly eyes be rendered blind to all illusion. Before the soul can hear, the image, man, has to become as deaf to roarings as to whispers, to cries of bellowing elephants as to the silvery buzzing of the golden firefly. Before the soul can comprehend and may remember, she must unto the silent speaker be united, just as the form to which the clay is modeled is first united with the potter's mind. For then the soul will hear and will remember, and then to the inner ear will speak the voice of the silence. Now we will continue with our discussion of what we were saying last week when we came to the end of our period. We were talking about the human body and the memory as to where it was, and we said that just to limit the memory to the brain would be to dwarf the universal mind, whose rays inform every rational mortal. Now, as we were discussing the mind, we defined the mind as having two different ways of functioning, and we separated nous, or the noetic action of the mind, from that of the phrenic or physical or intellectual mind. And we said that the wisdom that comes from above is what is required, whereas the earthly, devilish, comes from the lower mind. When we're in incarnation, we have to work through different principles, as has been explained in many of our discussions, and we need to keep those principles in mind. The divine mind, nous, is the noetic aspect of that mind, and we call it the higher mind, or the ego. The kamamanas, the rational, earthly, physical intellect of man, is encased in matter, and it is truly made flesh, that word made flesh. So this double changing in every incarnation is just there for one lifetime, and it is sometimes expressed as considering itself ego sum, and carrying out the manifestation of the mind through the organic system. Imagine itself that it's the only thing there, assumes that position, and the Buddhists call this heresy of separateness. Now, in the Theosophical teachings, we call the higher mind, the noetic aspect of it, coming from nous, the individuality, and the lower intellectual mind is defined as the personality, and we said that personality is just there for one lifetime. So that terrestrial wisdom, that devilish aspect, comes from that lower aspect of ourselves, because it is connected to stimuli that comes from our animal passions through the living body. Well, the higher ego, we also said, was part of that essence of the universal mind. So it has no capacity to be able to act directly on the physical aspect of the human life. It has to inform the man of flesh, and it works through its alter ego, which is the lower mind. So we have to consider these two aspects when we are talking about a man becoming a seer, a soothsayer, a prophet, and then the other one who enjoys the earthly aspect of our life, eating, drinking, enjoying sensual pleasures, and perhaps transacting business to the detriment of one's neighbor. This has nothing to do with the higher mind. It has no direct effect on these things. Neither does it have any dealings on the physical plane with either the brain or the heart. For these two organs of power are higher than the personality, and the lower is dealing with our passional organs, such as liver, stomach, spleen, but the higher function belongs to the brain and the heart. And this is the individuality we are talking about. So it stands to reason that we would have two sets of memory, one belonging to the higher mind and the other which is recorded as sense thought in the lower aspect. The other higher we call supersensuous or superconscious mental experiences, and we correlate these with the cardiac and cerebral centers. The memories of the flesh or the selfish deeds which are personal, together with the mental experiences of a terrestrial nature, consisting of earthly biological functions, correlate with molecular constitution of various chemic organs, such as we said liver, stomach, and these dynamic associations of the elements of the nervous system then is activated in each particular organ. So then we cannot say that the memory is just in the brain, because then we're limiting the universal mind's capacity. So in this philosophy, it is explained that every organ in our body has its own memory, and it is endowed with its own kind of memory, and we consider it psychic and noetic, depending where this recording has taken place. So in men then, there are physical and metaphysical forces. And depending where the impulse is coming from, whether it is psychic or noetic, the psychic is psychomolecular force which acts from without within. But the noetic, which is defined as the spiritual dynamical force, works from within, without. So, just as the body is the covering of the inner principles like soul, mind, life, the molecule or the cell is the body in which dwells its own principles, which are to our senses non-existent, and they are the immaterial atoms which composes the cell. So the cell's activity and behavior are determined by whether it is being propelled inwardly or outwardly. In other words, whether the force is noetic or psychic. The noetic has no relation to the physical cells proper. The the psychic action is dependent on the law of conservation and correlation of physical energy, but the atoms, being psycho-spiritual and not physical units, act under laws of their own. So every human organ and each cell in the latter has a keyboard of its own, just like the piano. But these organs registers and emits sensations instead of sounds. So each key then contains the potentiality, or good or bad. Either it is going to produce harmony or disharmony. So then we have to consider ourselves as a double-faced unity, because how the mind works. If the impulse to action comes from above, then it is representing the wisdom from above. The first up light being noetic or spiritual, the results will be in accordance with that and worthy of it. But if it is terrestrial devilish wisdom, which is the psychic power, then man's activities will be selfish, solely based on physical or his animal nature. So then the human body has truly been desecrated because of materialism, and because we have forgotten the truth about who we are. So we truly are the temple of the Adept, of the grandest, in fact, the whole mysteries of nature of our solar universe. The body is the Aeolian harp corded with two sets of strings. One is made of pure silver, but the other set is called gut. So when the breath of the divine fiat brushes softly over the silver pure strings, man becomes like unto his God. But the other set does not feel it. It is only responding to the terrestrial wind with animal propensities that makes its cords vibrate. So the function of the physical lower mind is to act upon the physical organs and their cells. But it is the higher mind alone which can influence the atoms interacting in these cells. As we said, the atoms are psycho-spiritual. They are not physical units. So the interaction of these atoms is capable of exciting the brain via the spinal center cord, and it brings about mental representation of the spiritual ideas far beyond object of this material plane. So the phenomena of our divine consciousness has activities that are on a higher plane, and that this is what we have to understand. the activities of the mind is on a higher plane, not physical. And working through something less substantial than the molecular movement of the brain substance. So, occultism teaches that the liver and the spleen cells are the most subservient in the body to the action of the personal mind, but the heart is the organ par excellence of the higher ego, but it has to act through the lower self because it cannot do so on its own on this plane. It does not belong to the physical plane of existence. So, when we are talking about the memory, we have to classify it into two distinct spheres. One from the above, and those physical ones from below, which are recorded in those kamic organs. Each cell in each organ having a consciousness of its own kind. So, it is these electrovital sparks that illuminate the field of consciousness in the lower ego. And it is these sparks that awaken to function what it has recorded or its reminiscences prior to that particular event. As the body, human body, is a vast sounding board in which each cell bears a long record of impressions connected with its parent organ, each cell has a memory of its of a particular consciousness of its kind, and perhaps we can call it instinct if you like. According to the nature of the organ, physical, psychic, or mental, as they relate to this or another plane. Please remember, memory also is recorded on different planes of activity. It's not just here. Even in the lower self, it can be physical, psychic, or mental. We call these states of consciousness because at that time, even today, there are no words to express it. At that time, the literature had to be written and they had to come up with these expressions because the English language lacks in metaphysical expressions. So these states of consciousness can be states of instinctual, mental, or purely abstract or spiritual consciousness. So, to trace all such activity or psychic actions through the brain work is because I think that the mansion called the brain in the body is kind of front door. It's the only one that opens into space. All the other doors or openings are in this private building called the body, the temple of us. And so these openings in the private building through which travel incessantly sensation and memory. It is being transmitted, in other words. So the clearness, the vividness, and the intensity of these depend on the state of the health of the organic soundness of the transmitters. But the trueness and the correctness is due to the principle in which they originate, and whether the lower manas or the noetic element is in preponderance, depending which one has the higher activity in it, in other words. So if it comes from the higher, it is noetic or manasic, and if it comes from the lower personality, it is termed phrenic, kamic, terrestrial element. So the mind entity that we called a unit being in the previous talks is of a divine homogeneous essence of Alaya-Akasa or Mahat, which is the universal mind. The personal as a temporary principle, because we explained it only exists during that one life period, one incarnation, is a temporary principle, and its substance is made of astral light. So a pure ray, the higher mind being a pure ray, as a son of the universal mind, cannot perform any functions in the body and remains powerless over turbulent organs of matter. The only way it can act is through the lower mind. Its inner constitution is manasic, but its body, or rather its functioning essence, is heterogeneous, and it is leavened with this astral light, which is the lowest element of ether. When we discussed Akasha, we said that the astral light is the lowest element of ether. So then, it is the mission of the manasic ray to get gradually rid of this blind deceptive element, which though it makes of it and kind of active spiritual entity on this plane, still it brings it into such a close contact with matter that it entirely beclouds its divine nature, and it stultifies its intuitions. In other words, it can't act, it becomes dormant. And we have to understand that this in us has to be understood, because all that comes from the noetic is pure Alaya-Akasa, we said, because its essence is just that. And it gives us seership. But the wisdom, that psychic vision that comes from the lower intellectual, eventually leads us to mediumship. Now, in its discussion, we have discussed this a lot prior to this talk. We need to understand that in this cycle that we are in, this psychic ability in us is going to develop, because just like we went through the kamic phase of our being, and that principle is perfected, but humanity made something different out of it. Kama is love, but it really is universal love. However, humanity has to grow to that through having a family life, a personal love, in other words, and eventually open it from that to its higher application, which is that universal compassion, universal love, kindness, charity for all. And we have to start from the family life, then enlarge it to the community, and then to our nation, and then we can become a member of the universal family. So we can have that seership by paralyzing the memory and that instinctual ability of the material organs and even the cells in those organs in the body of flesh. We just said we can paralyze it and allow the higher ego or our individuality to be in charge. And this is when seership comes about. But to do that, to be able to paralyze the lower, requires an adept. We are not able to do that at this stage of our development. And another one is, another possibility is that if we have come into this incarnation as a very high, holy person in the yogi state, because we brought it through our efforts from a previous life, and we're able to express that in this life. So we can reach that higher mind field operation if we are really holy and also interested in helping humanity, because it's a spiritual force we are going to use. We cannot be personal with it. It has to be impersonal. And there was another section that discussed the weakness and exhaustion of the material body. In other words, when we are really, really extremely ill and suffering, the body is kind of in that exhaustion phase, and we can access the higher mind field, but it is not intentional. In other words, we're not doing it purposefully. It just is available because of the exhaustion of the body. Now, we should really ask the term as to what a medium is. It is a dangerous and abnormal normal disease according to this philosophy. A medium is simply someone whose personal ego or terrestrial mind, psyche, is impregnated with this astral light. And so the whole constitution is overpowered by that astral light presence. It's everywhere in the body, in other words. So every organ and cell therefore is attuned to this enormous and abnormal tension because of the presence of that astral light. The mind is ever on the plano and immersed in that deceptive light whose soul is divine, but whose body, the light waves on the lower plane are infernal. And so they reflect the black disfigured memories of earth that we have put there. Now, the untrained eye cannot differentiate between the dense fog of the terrestrial emanations and cannot see the radiant light behind it, which then would impart to us eternal truths. So whoever is in this condition, their vision is out of focus. And so their senses, being accustomed from birth to this very high tension, they are like compared to people who live in the slums and who become kind of accustomed to the stench and the filth. So these distortions of the sights and images on the waves of the astral plane, the medium cannot discern and does not understand that what he or she is looking at is not true but false. So the person then consider these pale soulless corpses moving in the Kamaloka as images of the living departed ones, and the broken echoes of one's human voices passing through his mind suggest to him well-coordinated phrases which he repeats, in ignorance that the final form and polish were received in his own brain factory. And hence the sight and hearing of that, if it was in its true nature, would have struck the medium's heart with cold and terror, now fills him with a sense of beatitude and confidence. He really believes that the immeasurable vistas displayed before him are the spiritual world. And these are the disembodied angels. But this is a kind of general explanation of it. And mediumship is considered a very dangerous, full of psychic experiences, if accepted indiscriminately, that actually leads people to deceive others. And the medium himself or herself, of course, is the first one that has been deceived. So it is stated that this all-terrestrial serpent, the astral light, is apparently very infectious, and the odic and magnetic currents of the astral light often can incite people to commit murder, become drunken, be involved in immorality, and not altogether, if the natures are not pure, they can be driven headlong by these blind forces set in motion in the light to commit errors and sins from the waves. So in order to become a sovereign human being, and it leads us towards adeptship, we have to use our willpower. But we said in the previous talk that this willpower, this spontaneity, this free will is the aspect of the higher mind, and it is necessary that we use it in order to free ourselves from the dual current of this light, which is the living and astral fire of the earth. And I think this quote is from Eliphas Levi. He says, "In very fact, it is the blind force which souls, that is the lower manas or nefesh, have to conquer to liberate themselves from the bonds of the earth. For if their will does not free them from this fatal attraction, they will be absorbed in the current by the force which has produced them, and will return to the central and eternal fire." And explanation given for the central and eternal fire is that this is the disintegrating force that gradually consumes and burns out the Kamarupa or personality in Kamaloka, whither it goes after death. So, we will finish with the statement, "Blessed is he who has acquainted himself with the dual powers at work in the astral light. Thrice blessed he who has learned to discern the noetic from the psychic action of the double-faced God in him, and who knows the potency of his own spirit or soul dynamics." Thank you. If you have any questions, please submit them and we'll answer them. Thank you.